Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pam Cohn, and it is an honor to serve as the host for this podcast series. Today, we are privileged to have with us Christopher Swee, the Chief Marketing Officer at Boyden, which is a global executive search and advisory firm. Welcome, Chris. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Pam. It is my absolute pleasure to be here.
And for the audience pleasure and knowledge, I have to admit that Chris and I go back probably 30-ish years, but we won't talk about that.
You're right, Pam.
So let's talk about Boyden and the services that you provide clients around the globe.
Sure. So we've been around since 1946. Boyden, we like to say, was one of the pioneers of executive search. And in those 40, or starting from 1946, and then in the past, 70 plus years, we've really evolved into more than just executive search and more into the field of talent advisory services. So what that means is, in addition to executive search and finding the right leaders out there, it's also leadership consulting and a variety of services that come with leadership consulting, as well as interim management, finding interim leaders for organizations that need a stopgap measure. So it really is a pretty diverse offering that we offer on a global level.
And just like law firms, I'm guessing that you're seeing ESG emerge as a need and area that you can consult and advise clients. And then there's also ESG for Boyden itself. So let's start with, how did Boyden first see ESG emerging as an important topic for your clients and therefore your advisory services?
Yeah, good point, Pam. I'll be brutally honest. The entire initiative came to a head when around the globe our partners were starting to get RFPs, requests for proposals, that included questions about ESG, not only about Boyden's internal capabilities in terms of providing the right leaders with an ESG lens, but also what is Boyden doing as an organization to be more compliant on the ESG front. And as you can imagine, when partners have to answer these types of questions, it raises not so much a red flag, but they stop and pause. Mm-hmm. And I think collectively around the organization, the advent of RFPs and organizations and our prospective clients that were asking for this type of information really made us stop and pause and say, okay, we got to do two things. Number one, we've got to get our house in order. As you can imagine, being a global organization, it can be very difficult because ESG means different things in different parts of the world, and there's different levels of severity. So that was step one. And step two is, was how can we become leaders in understanding the needs of our clients and filling the needs with the right type of leadership, the new, sort of a new perspective on how we can bring different types of leaders to the forefront. So the way I look at it, and I think the way our organization looks at it, is from an internal perspective, looking inside, what are we doing to be a better organization around the world on all ESG fronts? And then how can we help move the ESG initiative forward in terms of finding the right types of candidates out there for various different positions?
So my guess is, when you're looking at helping your clients with their ESG, the biggest challenge is just what you said. How do you find people with ESG expertise to help meet your client needs?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. And as you know, the field continues to evolve in terms of ESG overall. I think there's still a lot of learning, from the corporate level as to what ESG actually is. I mean, it's easy to fall into the environmental side of the fence and think green, but a lot of people don't equate the whole, DEI and gender equality and racial equality and things like that as being a major component of ESG. So I think people tend to put things in silos and look at them in a siloed way. And so that's a challenge. It's a challenge for us as, we're in the business of finding people, right? And understanding people skills and qualifications and leadership styles. It's difficult to try to find people who can span that entire chasm of the ESG challenges out there. And I'll be honest, we don't have all the right answers. We're getting better at it, but it's it's an ongoing evolution.
I know part of your work has to do with finding or advising boards on either finding new board members or helping them figure out what sort of management positions they need. Are you seeing that shift to include or perhaps even focus more on ESG?
I think so. And again, I think it's happening more so in pockets. We've got a couple of partners in the US that focus on board services, and they are starting to see some progress. Again, it depends on industry,
Yes.
size of the organization,
Yes.
history of the organization, and their appetite for change. But I think particularly in the US, you're starting to see a little bit more momentum with that change. Is it happening fast enough? Probably not. But it is progress moving in the right direction. I think when you start to look outside of the US, it's still somewhat of a neutral landscape. And there's certainly pockets within areas in EMEA, where the complexity or the complexion of boards and the structure of boards is changing a little bit. I think once you get past Europe and you get into Asia Pac, it's still, I don't want to say it's not progressing, but it's almost flatlined.
Yep.
And that goes back to the point I made earlier, that it's hard to take a singular lens on what ESG means and overlay it across the entire world, because there are just areas within certain areas of the world that it's many of the issues that we're facing here in the US are just not on the radar of not only of executive search firms, but also on corporations.
Yep.
Now they may be facing some other challenges, and yes, there are certainly some sort of ubiquitous issues that everyone is facing, and I think those tend to get dialed up in those areas. But in some cases, things are spiking, and in some cases, they're not in terms of importance.
So I want to go back to something you said earlier about RFPs coming from your clients and customers that are asking you about Boyden's ESG practices, because Boyden is structured very much like law firms are structured, right? You're a service,
Correct.
Professional services business. You have offices around the globe. You have partners who are building their own practices. So how do you get your arms around what Boyden as an entity is doing for ESG? So let's start with, what are you tackling as a firm, or what is most material? What elements are you working on as Boyden for your own ESG internal progress?
Right. Well, first of all, we took your absolutely important advice when we worked together a few years ago on how we could sort of get our house in order. And that first step for us has been to join the United Nations Global Compact, which is the world's largest initiative in terms of ESG overall. And there's different levels, obviously, and layers to the United Nations Global Compact, and we are a new member. It is something that we feel from an internal perspective, all of our offices around the world can get on board with. And there's so many different aspects of the UNGC that offices in certain regions of the world can dial up what they feel is important in their region and dial down some of the other things. So joining the UNGC is certainly step one. The second step for us is, and quite frankly, to my surprise, a few of our offices took the initiative on their own to become more ESG centric. And they started with little things like, let me take a quick step back on that, because for the most part, our people in offices around the world at first blanch would say, well, what can we be doing to help our environment? We don't produce anything. We don't manufacture. We're a professional services firm. But then when you start looking around the periphery on that, it's everything from reducing your carbon footprint. What are you doing on a recycling basis? What are you doing in terms of traveling? And are you spending an inordinate amount of time, on an airplane? So, I mean, there's lots of things that I think our people weren't thinking about necessarily, but over the past 2 years, it has been more front and center. So now let me fast forward to a couple of our offices taking the initiative to becoming greener, to taking the initiative to get involved with agencies that will plant trees on behalf of us placing candidates, which I think is a fantastic initiative. And they did this sort of on their own after we, to be honest with you, after we engaged with you 2 years ago, and you made a really nice presentation at our Chicago World meeting talking about what we can be doing. So these offices went out on their own, and what we're trying to do is use them as a bit of a template, a blueprint, so to speak, for our offices around the world to follow. What can they be doing on a local level basis? Again, that's going to be different across all of the different regions, but I think there's enough flexibility there so that our offices can get involved at the local level, and then overlay initiatives like the UNGC. We're also thinking about becoming engaged with EcoVadis, right, in terms of scoring who we are and how we're doing. So that's probably going to happen in 2024 from a global perspective. So my hope is we're doing some global initiatives that are being bolstered by local initiatives, and that will help get our house in order.
Yeah. I am enthused to hear you say that these things are bubbling up out in your offices, because I often feel like ESG generally is more successful when it bubbles up rather than when it's dictated down. Dictated down, if anybody feels this is pushed on them, the resentment will be high. Whereas these things bubble up of their own volition, their own ideas, what's appropriate for their market, it's going to succeed. And the other thing I was really pleased to hear you say is that Boyden has become a member of the UNGC. And I am a huge proponent of the UNGC because I think, for all the reasons you said, it is flexible enough and it has enough elements to it that any office in any country all around the world can find something that resonates with them where they can make a difference. And it's all under the UNGC umbrella. So I think it's a perfect fit for global professional service firms to connect to and to use as their framework. So here's a political question for you, literally. I know Boyden is global, and this question really focuses on the US, but what of the anti-ESG campaign, are you seeing that in the work you're doing for clients, or are you seeing that internally, sort of a pushback to all things ESG?
There's no doubt that you're starting to see that in the US for sure. I don't think and I'll give you just a little peek behind the curtain here, because we're an organization that is made up of offices that are individually owned and that contribute to sort of a global network. We canvass several times a year our offices in terms of what their needs are. And then we also look for them to develop revenue forecasts as we're doing planning for the next year, actually the next 2 to 3 years. Part of that surveying of the offices is we've got questions that are you've seen in the marketplace, and what are you hearing from clients? I think that what I'm hearing from the US specifically is that there's still interest, that clients are still sort of trying to move the initiative forward. I'm not getting the sense that there's pullback from our partners, on the ground that are hearing from clients. I'm not getting that sense. I'm seeing that in the news and things like that, and certainly you're hearing a little bit of that drumbeat. But when I'm asking our partners, is this still important for the clients that you're going out to? The answer is yes. So I'm not seeing that now. There's a tendency in the executive search industry that there's a little bit of a lag behind what's going on out there in the marketplace. But will we see a bit of a slowdown? I don't know. I'm not seeing it yet.
Excellent. That's very good news. So given all the challenges facing society today, for the business of executive search, and also just for your work personally, what gives you hope? If some of my Boyden colleagues are going to listen to this podcast, they may laugh a little bit, but this organization can be a little bit like herding cats, right? So we've got, because we're not a centralized organization, and because we're global, there are so many different perspectives on what we should be tackling from a societal standpoint, and how we should be moving forward. I think what gives me hope is I think we've got our organization, for the most part, everyone's on the same page in terms of what we should be doing and how we should be acting, and what are the challenges from a global perspective. Again, just talking about leadership and finding the right leaders and the right people to lead organizations. And that's hard to do, I think. I mean, it's hard to do in any organization, but to get people who are basically owners of their own local business to buy into sort of a unified movement going forward is, I think is it's really nice to see. And that's what gives me hope, right? That if we can do it on, at this level, hopefully we'll be able to find the right people out there, to plug in, to make changes within organizations. There's always going to be differences. There's always going to be, as I had mentioned earlier, things that are more important in some markets versus others, whether it's by region, by industry, et cetera. But I think if everyone can get the basics right and understand that at the end of the day, this is all very important, that's a plus, that's a positive, and it gives me hope. That's wonderful. So let's say we do another podcast a year from now. What will have changed? What will we talk about that's different than today?
Well, we would have had our first communication on progress with the United Nations Global Compact, which I'm looking forward to. And for those of you that don't know what that is, as part of the UNGC, you basically have to publish what you've done or what you're doing on an ESG front for your organization. And there's no right or wrong answers to that other than showing progress going forward. So we would we would certainly have that done. We will have the organization become more in tune with all of the initiatives that the UNGC can provide. My hope would be that we would have a pretty good percentage of our offices engaged to some level in local ESG related initiatives. Whether it's as small as putting recycling cans throughout their office. I mean, that's an easy step, all the way through to engaging in outside resources locally to help their office become more compliant. So my hope would be that would be in place a year from now, and that we would be finding the right people out there and help develop the right leadership, or at least the right leadership skills that we could be presenting to organizations. Tall task, but I think you've got to aim high, right? To be able to at least make a change and provide some positive results.
Yep. Well, those are all very admirable goals, and I definitely do want to have you back a year from now so we can check in and see how we're doing.
That would be awesome, Pam. I would love to do so.
Thank you so much for joining us today for your insights. I think there are huge parallels between the types of professional services that Boyden provides its clients and the type of professional services and challenges that law firms provide their clients. So it's a great analogy, and we'll be eager to hear your story a year from now.
Thanks, Pam, and I will be all up for it, for sure.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Pam.